let me know. Good morning. I'm very happy to be here with you today. I'm Kendra Hotz. I'm the director of the Urban and Community Health Program at Rhodes College, and I'm in the Religious Studies department. So this is actually my second visit to Calvary. I was here about a year ago doing some stuff on faith and health with my husband, Matt Matthews. So I'm really happy to be back again and to see you. We're going to try to make this as interactive as possible, so just because I'm the one with the microphone, you shouldn't feel like you're not supposed to be talking. In fact, I will prod you if you're not talking. We are going to be working today on the book of 1 Samuel, and let's begin with prayer. Let us pray. Blessed are you, O God, giver of all good gifts, for you have gathered us, your people, in the warmth of this fellowship. You have surrounded us with your love, and you have spoken to us through your prophets of old. Gather us now, we pray, that we might hear your word, that we might understand it, and that we might be transformed by it. For the gift of this good word, for the gift of this good fellowship, for the gift of this good world, we give you thanks. Amen. So what I want to do is start by getting us situated historically. I know that you've been working on the narrative arc of the Hebrew Bible, and you've been thinking about how the different stories fit together into one big story. Let me check in with you and ask, how much have you been thinking about the historical context? When you're reading 1 Samuel, do you know where you are in Israel's history? No. Okay, let me do a really quick crash course in biblical studies and say anytime you're reading the Bible, you need to be thinking about 3 different contexts to make sense of the story. First, you need to think about, when did this happen? When was the historical context when these events would have taken place? Now, sometimes the events you're reading about don't take place. For instance, I think you read the book of Ruth, for instance, and that is set in the period of the Judges, but that is a work of historical fiction. And so in that case, you don't need to ask, when did Ruth actually live, because that's a different kind of literature. When we're looking at 1 Samuel, though, we are thinking of a text that reports events that would have taken place in ancient history, and the time period for that is the 10th century. Israel is leaving a period of a confederacy when the 12 tribes simply cooperated with each other under a treaty of mutual defense. And if you read the book of Judges, then you know that that wasn't working out very well for them. The very end of the book of Judges gives us this terrible account of a war between the tribes, predicated on the rape of a woman. And the book ends by saying, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own sight. And as the reader, you should say to yourself, whew, they need a king, right? This is what happens when you don't have a king in Israel. All right, so first you want to ask yourself where you are historically. 10th century, the beginning of the United Monarchy, when the 12 tribes become a nation rather than simply a confederacy. The second question you have to ask yourself about context is, when was it written down? When were these events recorded? Because people don't write history just because they want to make sure details are remembered. People write history because the events of the period they are investigating tell them something about their own period. And their own historical context shapes the way they remember and tell those stories of the past. And so you have to ask yourself, when was this written down? In the case of 1 Samuel, that's a complicated question to answer. Kind of a final point when this book is coming together would be the 6th century, when the people of Judah are living in exile. I'll come back to that in a minute. Third context you have to ask yourself in order to make sense of any biblical text is, what is my context? When do I live? What's happening in my world that shapes the way I read and remember these stories? So context, context, context. When did it happen? When was it written down? When do I live? And how does that shape the way I tell and remember these stories? In order to make sense of Samuel, you need to think about the 6th century. You need to think about exile, because exile is the event in Judah's history that shapes the way they remember everything else. It's this devastating moment when everything they think makes them who they are is stripped away from them. You read the story of Abraham, right? And you remember that he formed a covenant with his God. And the covenant stipulated things like, well, I'll ask you, what would Abraham get out of this covenant? What would make Israel a nation? Wild guess. There you go, land. They would have the promised land. Anything else? I will make of you a great nation. I'll make you a great nation. So there was also this promise that they would be a prominent, important player on the political landscape. Okay? You would have land. You would be a great nation. Later, other things were added to the covenant. You would have a temple, and your God would always live in your midst, and you would have a monarchy that would never end. And that was promised, that the lineage of David would always rule Israel, that there would never be an end to it. You would have land, you would have influence, you would have a temple, you would have a monarchy. In the 6th century, when the Babylonians invade and destroy Judah, the population is stripped of its status as an independent nation, and the people are carried away into exile in Babylon. That tragic psalm, we sat by the rivers and wept. How can we sing your song in a foreign land? We don't have our land. We are not a great nation. The Babylonians have killed the last heir of David. That was a dynasty that lasted 400 years. That's an unimaginable length of time for a single dynasty to consistently produce a male heir who lives long enough to see his heir survive and reproduce. 400 years of that. No more dynasty. And the temple was destroyed, burnt to the ground, the city razed, the walls destroyed. All of the conditions of the covenant were obliterated. So there you live in Babylon. You're not a great nation. You don't have a king. You don't have a temple. You don't have land. In what sense are you still the people of God? This is the question. It's at that moment in their history that they begin to weave this narrative together. There's a school of history called the Deuteronomistic history. We're going to shorten that to the DH so that we don't have to keep repeating Deuteronomistic, which is a mouthful. The DH, not really a single person, really kind of a school of thought, living in exile, composes a national epic, a history of Israel that tells the story from the time they enter the promised land at the beginning of the book of Joshua until the time they exit the promised land and go into exile at the end of Kings. Think of this as a history in 4 volumes. There are 4 books of the Deuteronomistic history: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Now maybe you're thinking to yourself, but wait, I have 2 Samuels and 2 Kings. Are you thinking that? Yeah, you know why you have 2 Samuels and 2 Kings? It's got to do with a limitation of ancient technology. They wrote on scrolls. You can only make a scroll so long before it gets too heavy and rips in the middle. And so you make a scroll just long enough to have as much writing in it as possible without being so heavy that it tears. Well, you finish, you're writing Samuel and you run out of space on the scroll, So you get out a second scroll and you finish the story. Samuel's just one book. It's just divided into two because the scroll wasn't big enough. I love it that this technology, which is not limited in the same way, still reflects the reality of the scroll. That's even funnier if you're reading your Bible on a tablet or something where the whole thing could be one scroll. We still divide it. Same thing with 1st and 2nd Kings. They just ran out of room on the scroll, so they had to finish the story on another one. So 4 books: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. Now, you may notice that your Bible has something stuck into the middle of those 4 things. What's stuck into the middle there? Ruth. Why is Ruth in the middle? Because Ruth is set in the period of the Judges, but it is not part of that same long work written by that author, the Deuteronomistic historian. So the order in which the books are put in the Bible is not because they were all written by the same person or something like that, and not even because they were written during the same time period. The book of Ruth is actually a lot later. Okay. If you live in the 6th century, you are a Babylonian exile, and you don't have your king, and you don't have your land, and you're not a great nation, and you don't have your temple, and you decide to write a history of your nation from the time it took possession of the land until the time it left possession of the land. What do you think are the questions that organize your research as a historian? What are you trying to figure out? Oh, okay, you want to know the sequence of the events. Absolutely. What else? You want to know why this happened. What's the meaning of it? You want some source of hope. Okay, anything else? You want to know who the central players are, who shaped our story. I want to know why this happened. How did we end up in this situation? It actually looks like the Deuteronomistic history has 2 endings. At the very beginning, Joshua is this strong leader who is absolutely faithful to the God Yahweh, who sets aside everything else to worship only that God, and who refuses to assimilate to the cultures around him in Canaan. At the first ending of this long history, you have a king named Josiah, who is incredibly faithful to a single God. In between, you have ups and downs and ups and downs. You have great leaders who take the people astray, who worship the gods of the Canaanites. You have great leaders who bring the people back to faithfulness, back and forth, back and forth. The story of Josiah tells how he became king, and he asked his court scribes to go and check the archives for any important documents that he should be aware of. They find in the archives essentially the 10 Commandments. You know what the first commandment is? You know what the first commandment is, right? You shall have no other gods before me. Well, here's the deal. The temple in Jerusalem was filled with altars to all kinds of gods. Now, the 10 Commandments is a conditional covenant. If you do these things, then you get those things. What things do you get? A king, a temple, land, and greatness. If you don't do those things, then, whoops, Josiah tears his clothing. He must have pulled his hair out. He orders all of his court functionaries to go to the temple and clean it out. Get everything out of there except the altar to Yahweh. And the altar to Yahweh was actually understood to be the footstool to the throne. The footstool to the throne was called the Ark of the Covenant. Now, you ran into that today, right? That's part of the reading that you did for today. Okay, Josiah says, oh my gosh, this is a disaster. We're going to lose everything. He cleanses the temple. The people go into mourning. They repent. And you have this great moment where everybody is restored to the way things are supposed to be. So think about that. If you're a historian, that's a fantastic moment to tell the story. We started with Joshua and everything was perfect. We made a lot of mistakes along the way, and then we ended with Josiah and everything was perfect. They lived happily ever after. The end. And then exile. Oops. They lived happily ever after didn't last very long. 2 generations after Josiah, the Babylonians take the people into captivity. So you end up in captivity, and here you've got this 4-volume history. They live happily ever after, and you're not real happy. It's time to rewrite it. It's time to go back and rethink. And so the second ending to the Deuteronomistic history is the one that takes you all the way to exile. The history draws on all kinds of resources. Folk tales like the story of Samson. It draws on historical archives. Sometimes the Deuteronomistic historian tells us what the sources are. Like you'll read in the middle of Kings about something a king did, and then the historian will say, but I will not record the rest, for are not the deeds of King so-and-so recorded in the annals of the kings of Israel, or the annals of the kings of Judah? Right? So I'm not going to write down the rest because you can go and consult that other thing to see what the other details are. Have you ever read the Annals of the Kings of Israel? Annals of the Kings of Judah? Do you know why? Yeah, they don't exist anymore. They didn't survive. Probably they didn't survive the Babylonian invasion. They were most likely kept in the palace archives, and that would have been burned. Plus, do you want to read the Annals of the Kings of Judah? I really don't. I mean, it's probably stuff like we traded, 18,000 goats for 20,000 sheep. And that stuff can be fascinating, but not to me. So what the Deuteronomistic historian has done is pulled together those details, filtered out what seemed irrelevant to tell this story, and it's a story about faithfulness and faithlessness. The source of hope, and you'll get to this next week, I think, is that there's one covenant. It's called a royal grant covenant, and it's made with King David. It is the center point of this history. Think of the history as starting with Joshua. Here at the center is David, and then here at the end is exile. That center point is the promise that God will never take steadfast love from the line of David. That covenant is everlasting, that it will never end, that there will always be an heir of David who rules Judah. And so in exile, the promise of a new king, and the term for king is just Messiah. That's not a special term that would only apply to Jesus. David would be Messiah. Saul would be Messiah. Solomon would be Messiah. These are all anointed ones. These are all kings. The hope is that God will bring a new Messiah. And for our own context, you can think about how that hope builds between the 6th century of before the Common Era and the 1st century of the Common Era. When people describe Jesus as Messiah, they do have some political expectations. All right, now let's get ourselves back to the beginning of the book of Samuel. We have been in the period of the Judges. We have got this account of how everything in Israel is falling apart because they don't have a king. And you've ended the book of Judges with that comment, in those days there was no king in Israel and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And you, readers in the 6th century, are thinking, we need a king, right? And you're ready for it. You're ready for the next king. Now, let's go back to the 10th century. In the 10th century, you've got increasing urbanization. You've got increasing population density. You've got people who are moving from a period where they are more pastoral and semi-nomadic, following the herds, to a period where they are increasingly agricultural, meaning they're farming land, living in cities, and they are thinking, who are we now? As we shift into this new, more population-dense, more urban context. Throughout the book of Samuel, you are always at those two different points. You've got one foot in the 10th century, thinking about how we make sense of our political identity in the midst of these massive demographic shifts, and you've got one foot in the 6th century where you're asking, what was happening back then, and what did it mean? You've ever read The Crucible by Arthur Miller? Great play, right? What's it about? Salem witch trials, right? That's 17th century stuff, right? When was it written? It's written during the Red Scare, right? During McCarthy era. Let me ask you one more time. What is it about? It's about the Red Scare, right? You don't actually know what the Crucible is about if you don't know what was going on in America in the mid-20th century. What I want us to remember is that we don't actually know what Samuel is about if we think it's just about the Salem witch trials. If we think it's just about what's happening in the 10th century, we're missing the point. We always have to remember that it's written during exile, and exile shapes what they care about, what they're interested in, what they remember, and what they think it means from 4 centuries earlier. Okay, now let's get to what you came here today for. We're going to start right there at the beginning of 1 Samuel, and you have read a story about Hannah and her son, eventually, Samuel. Let's just think through some of the features of this story. What jumps out at you in these first 4 chapters about Hannah and Samuel and Eli's sons? What was going on? Well, who's Hannah? Did I read the same thing you read? Really? Because I was assigned to do 1 Samuel 1 through 4, 8 through 13, and 15. Are we? Help me out here. What did you read? Okay. Okay. It's possible, I had one assignment, it's possible you had a different one, so we might not be working off exactly the same text. Do you remember the story of Hannah, like from when you were in 5th grade and did Sunday school? Oh, good. You had good 5th grade Sunday school teachers. What do you remember about Hannah? Blank sheet. Not unlike 18-year-olds in this respect. Okay, you remember that Hannah was barren, that Hannah had no child, and that she was desperate for a child. And so she went to pray. It says she went to a temple, but there shouldn't have been a temple in Israel at this point. And she prays that God will give her a child. And she promises that if you give me a child, I will give that child back. I will give that child back to you. There is a lot of play on the word give in these first 4 chapters. Samuel is a gift of God, and he is a gift returned to God. There's lots and lots. You see the word give over and over and over again in these chapters. In fact, Hannah does have a child, and she does give him to the safekeeping of Eli, who is both a judge and a priest, and Samuel is raised there in the temple. He is a gift, and he is given as a gift. It's a very positive appraisal of Samuel. He's a great ruler. He is a religiously devout person. He's a gift of God. Do you know what the Hebrew word for gift sounds like? That's a loaded question. Of course you don't know what the Hebrew word for gift sounds like. It sounds like this: Saul. Who's Saul? Do you remember who Saul is? Saul is the first king of Israel. Saul's heir does not become king after him. Who becomes king after Saul? David. And David's the one who receives that everlasting covenant. I just realized I'm not supposed to be moving around, and I am. David's the one who receives that everlasting covenant. If you're the Deuteronomistic historian, you've got this absolute commitment to the Davidic line. And you've got a problem. Because David isn't the logical heir of Saul. You need some account of what went wrong with Saul. And you've got a load of stories about the tremendous and great first king of Israel who was a gift of God. It sort of makes sense that the last judge of Israel would become the first king of Israel. And so scholars think that it's very possible that originally all of these stories about Samuel were about Saul, and that they were shifted so that these stories were attributed to a different figure, Samuel. Why would you do that? Why would you take nice stories about the great first king of Israel and make them stories about somebody else? Say again? That's right. It's not as easy to erase things in antiquity. Remember the victor's right history. It was the Davidic line who won. David doesn't want a whole bunch of great stories about Saul floating around. But these are fantastic folk tales. Everybody tells these tales. Everybody loves these stories. They're about Samuel. So what you're doing is sort of shifting the narrative so that what you're doing is giving a coherent account of how and why David became king and why David is the legitimate ruler of Israel. You will see some texts where it's clear that not everybody thought David was the legitimate heir that he was the legitimate king. There's a story where his son Absalom attempts a coup, and he drives David out of the city. While David's on the way out of the city, this little guy named Shimei, who's a relative of Saul's, comes out of his house and throws rocks at David and says, "Scoundrel, murderer, you have blood on your hands because you rule in the place of Saul, the rightful king of Israel." Right? There were people who didn't think David should have become king. David's got some PR work to do. And part of what we're seeing here is how that narrative shifts in favor of the Davidic dynasty. By the time you get to the 6th century, it's been 400 years. If you know anything about human genetics, you know that that is extremely unlikely to get that long of an uninterrupted dynasty. By the time you get to the 400-year mark, nobody's got any questions that David's the legitimate heir. And yet you have these artifacts remaining in the literature where we can see that there were earlier versions of those events. Okay, so let me see. Oh my goodness, I'm going on too long here. Let's take a look at the fall of Saul. And what I want to do is skip all the way to chapter 15, if you have it with you. If you don't, you'll survive. Okay, so here we are in chapter 15. We've seen Saul become king in chapters 8 through 13, And what we've seen in Saul becoming king, we've actually seen 3 different stories about how Saul became king. In the first case, Samuel found him with some donkeys. In the second case, lots were drawn. And in the third case, Saul had won a great battle and was made king by popular acclamation. Why do you think there are 3 different stories about how Saul became king? It's possible the public was divided about whether to have a king or not, and so they needed kind of multiple ways of affirming kingship. This is, remember, the first time they've had a monarch. Any other reasons why you might have 3 accounts of Saul becoming king? Just try to think it through from... These are oral traditions, right? These are stories told over a long period of time, and it's possible that there were different versions of how Israel got its first king, and when you're writing history, you want to preserve everything. And it's also important to remember that in antiquity, they didn't worry as much about consistency as we do. They worried more about losing things than they did about making everything fit just perfectly. And so it didn't bother them that they had 3 different accounts that in some ways are incompatible with each other. We're also at such an early point in Israel's history that it's possible there's stories about more than one figure who's proclaimed king, and over time those coalesce around a single individual. But one way or another, we get to the point where Israel says, we want a king, we need a king, give us a king. Samuel is outraged that the people want a king and say, God is supposed to be your king. You're rejecting your God as king if you want a human king. But relents and reads the people the riot act. If you get a king, this is what happens. And I want you to hear some of what happens if you get a king. And I want you to remember that this would not have been preserved if a king had not wanted it preserved. So I'm going to ask you after I read this, if you were a king, why would you want this preserved? So Samuel reported all of the words of Yahweh to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will rule over you." Now you keep a mental list of what the king will do. Ready? You're keeping that list, right? "He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands, and commanders of 50, and some to plow the ground, and some to reap the harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you will be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king whom you have chosen for yourself, but Yahweh will not answer you in that day." But the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, "No, we are determined to have a king over us so that we may be like other nations, and our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles." What will a king do? Form an army. Okay, what else? Take your stuff. That's called taxes. What else? Yeah, enslave you. You just have to kind of knuckle under and do whatever the king says. You've got a form of military conscription here. He will take your sons and make them run before his chariots. That's the infantry. There's also a form of domestic conscription. He'll take your daughters for perfumers and bakers. He'll take 1/10 of your crops and your livestock. That's taxes. That sounds awful. Why, if you were a king, would you want preserved this terrible description of what kings will do to you? It's law and order, right? And to justify it, right? This is kind of a charter that says you agreed to it. You said you wanted all this stuff. You knew what you were getting into. And if you don't like it when I raise your taxes and conscript your sons and your daughters, phooey. You're stuck with it. You agreed to it, right? So if you were a person in power, you would actually want this preserved. And there's an anti-coup clause. It says in that day, if you complain, God won't listen to you. You just have to put up with it. And so the king can say, no revolutions. I've got it in the contract. Right? Okay. So then how do we get rid of that first king? Saul. Saul goes into battle, and he is responsible for conducting something called harem, which you may have learned about when you studied the book of Joshua. Harem is a form of total warfare. That is, the idea is that you kill everything that breathes. In order to avoid assimilation with the Canaanites, you remember this is being written in the 6th century, right? This isn't a historical account of how Israel took possession of the land. There's an alternate account in the book of Ezekiel that's much more accurate historically. But the book of Joshua says we went in there as conquerors who committed genocide. If you live in the 6th century, the point is we didn't assimilate with the Canaanites. And as a result, we were able to keep our identity. We live in Babylon. Don't assimilate to Babylonian cultural and religious norms if you want to keep your identity. Okay, so harem was that form of total warfare. It meant that everything that breathed would be killed, and that meant women and men and children, but it also meant livestock. And anything that didn't breathe had to be put into the temple treasury. So things that don't breathe are things like grain and silver and gold. Saul was supposed to have committed harem, but the last things that were going to be sacrificed, he was supposed to wait for Samuel to come. And Samuel didn't show up. It had been 7 days, and Samuel didn't show up. And so, this is chapter 15. I can't find the exact verse I need. He waited 7 days. Samuel didn't show up, so he committed the sacrifice himself. And God responds, I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not carried out my commands. Samuel was angry, and he cried out to the Lord all night. Samuel rose in the morning to meet Saul, and Samuel was told that Saul had gone up to Carmel, where he set up a monument for himself. Why did God reject Saul as king? Yeah, he didn't follow the ways, he didn't commit genocide. Yeah. Yeah. This text says that Saul violated the commandment of God by not completing the genocide. It's important for us, I think, to come to terms with the violence in our own texts. And not to say, oh, well, that's Old Testament, so it doesn't count for us. Yes, it does. This is our Bible. Violence is part of our heritage. We have to come to terms with that. So, but when you listen to the reason God suddenly decided Saul wouldn't be king, it's a weird reason. He waited 7 days and the meat was going bad, so he went ahead and made the sacrifice. A sacrifice in antiquity is a barbecue, right? It's not just a religious service, it's also, a feast, and the meat's going bad, so he does the sacrifice, and that's it? That's why you're not king? Is it just me, or is that kind of a lame reason? It's kind of a lame reason for not wanting Saul as your king anymore. Remember, these are texts produced by people who are advocates for David. This is like letting your worst political enemy be the one who tells the story of your political party. This is why you don't want the opposite side telling your story. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but there may be a little hint here about what's actually going on. Saul says to Samuel twice, he says, "They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best sheep and cattle to sacrifice to Yahweh your Elohim." So Yahweh was translated into English as Lord. Elohim is translated as God. Elohim is a title. Yahweh is a proper name. So like King Henry, you've got title and name, right? Elohim Yahweh is title God, proper name Yahweh. Sacrificed to the Lord your God. And then later he does it again. He said, "These were a sacrifice to be made to Yahweh your Elohim." Little hint there. What if Saul wasn't a Yahwist? We have throughout the Old Testament indications that the people were not consistently monotheistic. There's a little hint there that Samuel worshiped Yahweh and maybe Saul didn't. Well, who would Saul have worshiped? He named his eldest son Ishbaal. Ish is the Hebrew word for man. Baal is, you probably know who Baal is. That's a Canaanite god, right? It's the Canaanite god of thunder. And by the way, this is a great joke in the Old Testament. Anytime Yahweh thunders from heaven, he's stealing Baal's thunder. Right? What they're doing is attributing the characteristics of a Canaanite god to their god. So you'll hear that a lot. Yahweh thunders from the heavens, and you should be snickering because you're making fun of somebody else's god. Okay, back to this though. He named him Man of Baal. Maybe Saul didn't worship Yahweh. Now I'm going to mess that up just a little bit. You know how we can use the word Lord to mean a member of the nobility? You can also use the word Baal that way. And so it's possible he just named his son Nobleman. But it's ambiguous. And if you're building a case for the rejection of Saul as king, it makes sense to drop some hints that he wasn't a consistent Yahwist. Especially if you're setting yourself up for a contrast, the man after God's own heart, David. And that's who you will meet next Sunday. Thank you, everybody. I'll be with you, I think, 2 weeks from now, and we'll keep the story going. In the meantime, have fun with David.